Hello, good morning to you all. It's midday here in Brazil, and I am really glad for the invitation to give this talk at Sierra and Cicada and Anthropen conferences. I'm also thankful for the opportunity to present this in English. I know that linguistic politics is at the core of the decolonization project and decentered epistemologies and all that, but for now, my French is still not so good to give a conference. So I accept the opportunity to present it in English, and hopefully we will be able to more multilingual instances of debate and talk. And I would be more than glad to discuss in French or Spanish and, of course, Portuguese. And since English is not my first language, I feel more comfortable to present it in English, knowing that most of you doesn't have English as first language neither. So we are on a same ground in that matter. I will present a presentation on the screen right now. Uh, it's just a few pieces, but I think it will be helpful to follow the presentation. So that's the title of the presentation. I will talk about collaborative methodologies and the dilemmas of involvement with indigenous peoples in public anthropology. My name is Christian and I work here at the University of Brasilia, but I also am associate researcher of Sierra, which is to me right now a second house. The first part of the presentation that I would like to discuss is about this awkward entanglement between biopolitical and public anthropology in Brazil. So I will start the presentation now, and after that I will have only more two sections to present. So I hope to be talking for not well, let's go then. As you know, social and cultural anthropology as a discipline has many definitions and uses. One very current depiction of this variant of anthropology presents itself as a social science dedicated to interpret cultural diversity, and anthropologists working for the recognition and appreciation of cultural differences and the achievement of social justice within and across cultures. According to this view, the discipline portrays itself worldwide, achieving support and allowing anthropologists to take charge of many proactive roles. In that sense, and agreeing with Ida Susser, the pursuit of social justice in many contexts, although waning over the decades, has been a strong force in anthropology, if not a central tenet. On the other hand, such depiction might mislead the unadvised to think that organizations, governments, the market, or all of them altogether support anthropology and hire anthropologists to fulfill the purpose of protecting and celebrating human diversity. Far from it, anthropology has been accepted and institutionalized for its efforts to understand differences and render this knowledge applicable to classification, management, and control of human diversity whenever this has been made necessary. Therefore, every time I mention the discipline here, for like pen, I used widely the entry on biopolitics that is available there, as well as the entry on bureaucracy. I think these two are very important for the discussion today. And as a biopolitical discipline, I mean also those occasions when its heart-minded anthropologists declares to be seeking the common good and performing public anthropology. So I'm not opposing biopolitical anthropology to public anthropology and other kinds of anthropology. To think about anthropology in terms of disciplinarity is not new, but the critical consideration on the power effects of anthropological practice embedded in colonial and imperial powers, national governments, multinational companies, financial agencies, or as usual in universities and NGOs, is ethically unavoidable, especially for those who earn a living as academic or professional anthropologists dealing with public issues. It is sufficient to say that methodological reflexivity is an important ethical task to be undertaken anytime and everywhere by any anthropologist concerned with the effects of anthropological discourse on ethnographable peoples and their rights. That being said, what could we actually learn from the interpretation of anthropology as a biopolitical discipline that might help us untangle our practice, first from governmental rationality, and second, from the dilemmas this entanglement has been generating to the assurance of indigenous rights? To answer to these questions, I will look at the political, legal, and moral dilemmas of collaborative methodologies in public anthropologist practice with indigenous peoples in Brazil, and the efforts of such practice to promote social justice. By collaborative methodologies, I mean face-to-face interactions based on mutual confidence that anthropologists promote to carry out their fieldwork and to write its outcomes according to their indigenous needs, interests, and more importantly, it's to write its outcomes according to them in co-authorship and in co-production of theories. In the same tune, I call public anthropology the academic professional practice of anthropologists with public issues and policies, both as insiders and outsiders. That being said, I will continue with the controversial public critique of anthropological work on indigenous land claims processes in Brazil. The public disagreement I am referring to began some 10 years ago. It accuses anthropologists to be settling indigenes in different places of the country so they can create reservations afterwards. There is also an accusation that anthropologists are inventing new indigenous ethnic groups for the same purpose. Of course, the creation of reservations aim at raising money for environmentalists and NGOs, where anthropologists are later employed and carry out their work, and I quote, observing Indians like animals in the zoo. But the most moralist accusation of all blame anthropologists being effectively compromised with indigenous peoples and therefore failing to consider non-indigenous claims in the same processes, producing partial and fraudulent reports instead. It is a malicious way to produce a conflict of interpretations concerning anthropological involvement in ethnographic fieldwork, understood as it is as a phenomenological methodology that shapes the discipline's identity and its professional practice. I don't mean to answer to this insult here. It is always silly to pay attention to foolishness, but the fact that rumors reach Brazilian public opinion and became one of many public discourses about the discipline is now unquestionable. Therefore, I will address these scandalous accusations as a commonsensical event, aware that by doing so, I am valuing it much more than it actually deserves. The idea is to look for what can be done to improve our ways to communicate to a wider audience who we really are and what we really do as anthropologists concerned with social justice. Thus, I will sustain that to proper visualize and deconstruct the accusations laid on public anthropologists in Brazil, it is crucial to glimpse the structures of alterity that has been governing commonsensical events regarding indigenous peoples and also governing anthropology as a biopolitical discipline. Secondly, and as a consequence of the former, I will argue that we must get rid of the scopophile tendency to and embrace intercultural collaboration as an ethic and epistemic tool for the holistic comprehension of indigenous social problems and how these can be worked out with them alongside with rival groups, civil society, and the state. By doing so, I am seeking to reach out for a more ethically conscious anthropology, what is, in my opinion, essential to keep it driven to the public and to social justice and less vulnerable to lies and mischief. To address problems beyond the discipline and to talk about indigenous land policy in Brazil, we have to put into context that witch hunting launched against anthropologists in Brazil. It is necessary to consider the historical process that gave rise to the administrative process of demarcation of circumscribed territories for indigenous peoples almost 50 years ago. It dates back to the military regime and its obsession with the settler occupation of the Brazilian part of the Amazon rainforest. After the Statute of the Indian, it's a law numbered 6001 and was promulgated in 1973, still in force. National ethnocratic governments aimed at integrating and developing the region and encouraging work and the development of productive activities through education and training of indigenes and their children, most of the time at the cost of their territorial displacement and lives. In these terms, the Brazilian ethnic politics were centered on activities aimed at incorporating indigenous peoples into the national communion half of the 20th century, incoherent indigenous perspective for the proper acknowledgement of indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination lands. As it was elaborated during an assimilationist context, the legal definition of who is indigenous made him or her a relatively capable person or a second-class citizen subjected to coercive tutelage by the Indian National Foundation, the FUNAI. Only in 1988, the federal constitution revised this orientation, not indigenous people's rights to self-determination and the lands they traditionally occupy, but unfortunately, it was not followed by a necessary institutional reform of state agencies and practices. Therefore, it was very slowly that state executive administration acquired enough bureaucratic experience to ensure an effective indigenous land policy sensible to indigenous claims. In other words, it was only after decades of work on the acknowledgement of indigenous lands that the Brazilian state consolidated a bureaucratic system to identify and line off the limits of the territories traditionally occupied by the 305 indigenous peoples who speak 274 different languages in an approximate total of 1 million people. To tackle each case, this policy has been carried out by anthropologists working groups that ensure face-to-face dialogue in the field with all the conflicting parties involved in the indigenous land claim process. After for indigenous people. It is important to see that these reports are examined by other anthropologists, state technicians, and all this professional work brought a unique level of expertise achieved by anthropologists acting as public workers in or in collaboration with the state and on behalf of indigenous peoples. It is indeed impressive to verify under such challenging circumstances anthropologists managed to deliver in the last 30 years a universe of 562 indigenous lands, an average of 18 protected indigenous lands per year, which is equivalent to 160 million hectares and another 31 indigenous reserves. This represents 77% of the total of 708 lands that made up and are part of the indigenous land policy system, and which would represent about 15% of the national territory. That's the map that I would like to show to you, so you can have an image these indigenous lands. In red, you can see indigenous lands in the Amazon region, and much smaller indigenous lands scattered all over the country in the center of Brazil, in the northeast, in the south. You can see very tiny red dots spread all over the country. So in the Amazon, we have a massive concentration of indigenous protected areas. This is an expressive result achieved by anthropological expertise in the legal protection of indigenous peoples' rights to land, and that are essential for their physical and cultural survival. At the same time, more recently, it has recognized as well as a crucial contribution to deal with climate changes and the well-being of all living things. It is important to keep in mind that of the 15% mentioned above, there is no estimate for the amount of land effectively under exclusive use by its correspondent indigenous peoples. It ends generating a widespread interethnic conflict in all regions of the country where indigenous peoples live and strive to resist, where the parties, indigenous and non-indigenous, tends to break the governmentality of the land policy and resort not only to the lawsuits, but also to various forms of protest, social struggle, and direct confrontation. Up to this point, I only meant to present a social-political background to evaluate the centrality of anthropological work in the biopolitical indigenous land policy, and consequently the level of visibility the discipline achieved in the face of the public. The use of anthropology is due to the fact that the discipline techniques promote direct and effective dialogue with indigenous peoples, attentive to their cultural practices. There is no doubt that it is because of the involvement of anthropologists in the indigenous land policy that some room has been made possible for the direct participation of very minorized indigenous peoples in the definition of the territorial limits assumed by their lands. But we shall never forget that the anthropologist's public work derives from a land policy ruled by the state which is responsible for the definite boundaries of an indigenous land as an administrative category to arrange the relationship between the national society, local communities, markets, and the state itself, without compromising other political and economic interests on and underneath those same portions of land. Therefore, despite the exemplary nature of the anthropological work in the administrative process to ensure the rights of indigenous peoples to traditionally occupied lands, it has been so far a permitted anthropology, always subject to overarching powers which have been this political shift has been occurring due to the judicial pressure exerted by the dissatisfied parties with the demarcation process on the liability of 22% of indigenous lands is still to be regulated administratively, which corresponds to only 8.2% of what remains to be demarcated. These are the same parties voicing up the accusations mentioned before and that were published in print in 2010 on a special number by Veja magazine, the Brazilian counterpart of the Times magazine, and entitled The Bench of Opportunistic Anthropology. The authors of the article were frivolous enough to state that, and I quote, loose criteria for delimiting indigenous and quilombos reserves help to fatten the accounts of non-governmental organizations and further reduce the territory destined for Brazilians who want to produce. End of quote. Without presenting any proof and misquoting anthropologists, indigenes, and quilombolas, and adding to the piece a handful of miscalculated land percentages and maps, the article paved the Brazilian public opinion to suspect the professional work anthropologists. And since then, public anthropology has been facing a harsh and unfriendly siege in Brazil that does not seem to be ceasing anytime soon. That siege can be linked to the successive cuts in FUNAI's general budget, causing a reduction of the number of anthropologists hired at the agency to work on the land claim processes, mainly with the revision proposals of the overall indigenous land policy within the three branches of power. All of this has been raising doubts, legal uncertainty, and the promotion of setbacks on the process of guaranteeing indigenous lands in Brazil. But amid all this, the attack on anthropologists and their public practice achieved an unprecedented scale when a Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry, a CPI, to investigate the land settlement for indigenous people in Quilombos was enacted in 2016, the same year of Dilma Rousseff's and reenacted in 2017, accusing dozens of anthropologists of misconduct and criminally charging for their technical reports. It poses us a series of questions. How can we cope with this level of rampant opposition? How could we deconstruct the malicious accusations of public anthropologists that ultimately aims to legitimize the indigenous land policy implemented so far in order to cut it open for hydroelectric dams, mining, monocultural crops, and cattle? I'm not aware how much you know that in Brazil right now, there is I think that instead of waiting with the obtuseness of such discourse against anthropology and indigenous rights, we should look at it as an assemblage of commonsensical misrepresentations about anthropology and its subjects of study. So let me talk about common sense a little bit. It has been quite a while since Clifford Geertz presented his ideas on common sense as a cultural system. According to him, common sense is an organized sector of cultures. He thinks about it in terms of suburbs. And there are a number of reasons why dealing with it as an organized body of deliberate could lead us to useful conclusions. Among those reasons, the most important one is the fact that common sense emanates from spontaneous behavior, while it tends to think that it doesn't. As a matter of fact, while religion grounds its authority on revelation, science on methodology, ideology in moral passion, common sense bases its arguments on life experience itself. The world is its authority, exclaims Geertz. Unfortunately, I do not have enough time to examine the structure of thought that underlies all the commonsensical accusations laid on Brazilian anthropologists. Such analysis would certainly bring forward unprecedented light on the ethnocentrism, racism, patriarchalism, sexism, nationalism, and other unquestioned naturalized truths about indigenous peoples and, of course, about the work of anthropology itself. What I like to do instead is to question anthropology's part or even responsibility in this state of affairs. Not, of course, for what it has supposedly done, but for what it has not sufficiently done yet. And that is, namely, to change the common sense about indigenous and the legitimacy of their claims in the first place. The fact that anthropology still did not succeed to do so, I believe, lies at the core of the accusations its practitioners are facing because of their involvement with indigenous public issues. Perhaps this happens to be so because anthropology has not yet changed commonsensical notions about indigenes within the discipline either. Let's see. I would like to conclude this conference talking about indigeneity and autochthony, because these concepts present a set of crucial questions derived from anthropological values. These values are precisely the ones being questioned by the public with serious consequences for anthropological practice as well as for indigenous land rights. Authors like Gausset, Kenrick, and Gibbs were sharp to point out that indigeneity is a central issue for contemporary anthropology. According to them, the coexistence of indigeneity with other related concepts, such as autochthony, makes the discussion on the legitimacy of indigenous claims and anthropological responses to it even more complicated, because the anthropologists who talk about indigeneity are usually not the same as those who talk about autochthony. Thus, the term indigenous tends to be used for people who are already marginalized, while autochthons is generally reserved for people who are dominant in a given area but fear future marginalization. That being said, is an indigenous or autochthonous claim more legitimate when it aims at promoting cultural diversity and less legitimate when a group tries to impose its own cultural standards on others? Does it legitimacy does its legitimacy depend on whether it promotes tolerance or instead cultivates hate and exclusion of the other? Is it legitimate when it claims self-determination as a universal human right and illegitimate when it tries to restrict this right to some and deny it to others? Is it legitimate when it tries to redress past wrongs and illegitimate when it tries to perpetuate them? Do it the do the poverty and political marginalization of a group that makes is what makes its claim legitimate? Do indigenous and autochthonous claims need to aim at more equality in order to be legitimate? Before answering with a sound yes, it is to all these questions, one must face a decisive hesitation. How could they, or we, the anthropologists, make sure, for example, that a public discourse asserting equality would not be used to maintain structural inequalities at another level? All this questioning sheds new light on the charges and challenges faced by public anthropology working with indigenous peoples. They allow us to observe from a safe distance that the commonsensical accusations on anthropologists depart not only from capitalist interests on indigenous lands and resources, but also from a sense of injustice caused by the professional commitment of public anthropologists to the legal and more legitimate protection of indigenous rights, in detriment of the also legal but less legitimate rights of others. And more important, this questioning puts definitions of indigeneity and autochthony at the center of the authority structuring that is being built by this with the aid of anthropologists dealing with the indigenous land policy under biopolitical terms. What calls the attention is that along the phony accusations laid on public anthropology runs offensive feelings towards anthropology and anthropologists because of its preference for the wretched of the earth. This happens to be so because the idea of autochthony has been applied by colonialists to represent the inhabitants of these lands, and that notion was smuggled into anthropological discourse after its dubious or double-binded relationship with colonialism. It is worth of attention that whenever anthropologists are summoned to explain autochthony, they invariably turn to dictionaries and etymology, where we find an endogenous sense of autochthony underlying the mundane usages of the notion. As such, it is applied to specific peoples after an analogy with the natural world where plants, animals, minerals spontaneously sprout from the ground as if they were like mushrooms. According to this logic, there are primordial natural ties that unite individuals among themselves and to a particular land, region, or territory originating a singular gens of a unique generative environment. For many anthropologists, this is the mythic origin of Aboriginal peoples, whom they deem consciously or not a different, separate, and autonomous ethnos in the strict sense of the term. No wonder anthropologists collaborating with indigenous peoples are thus considered unpatriotic with their own nation and gens. Nonetheless, the autochthon is indeed hyperreal, considering previous and ongoing migrations, mixtures, and interconnections with other peoples and regions. It only exists in its fairly pure state for those alienated from the spontaneous process of semantic invention which creates it. Hence, the hyperreal autochthon is a figure of folk imagination that lends to those who do not consider themselves to be an autochthon per se the authority to depict the first as he or she pleases. Under such figuration, biopolitical anthropology in Brazil presented many areas for those indigenous peoples classified as primal, uncontacted, or non-acculturated peoples living in the Amazon since times immemorial. The idea of autochthony to define indigenous peoples does present an obstacle for the classification and recognition of other indigenous authorities, particularly those that emerged through and creolization as a historical process of the colonization of the country. In that sense, anthropologists like Robert Payne, among others, sharply pointed out to the critical and therefore more conceptual sense of indigeneity that emerged from the disruptive scenarios brought up with colonization and interethnic relations. Payne explained the former definition of aboriginality or autochthony as an imposition of the colonial being on the native's being for the sake and control and exploitation of the indigenes and their territories. At the same time, they ethnically elaborate their own sense of belonging at the native's expense. To put it more bluntly, the non-autochthon allochthons conceive the being of autochthons as original and anterior, in comparison to themselves as exterior and subsequent, in order to justify their own civilizing narratives and practices of colonization and nation building. Therefore, autochthony as a historical process of interethnic domination is better understood in terms of its emergence within colonial situations where the autochthon may signify multiple things at the same time. We need only consider how Louis Riel, as a French-speaking poet and Métis leader, represented different political realities for English, French, and native people in the 19th century and beyond. As a consequence of the heteroglossic nature of colonial situations or plural societies, indigenous peoples themselves, on the other hand, have been subverting colonial senses of autochthony in order to claim their right to self-determination, meaning their right to autonomously represent themselves as distinct peoples on their own terms. As it has been asserted by the Catarist movement in Bolivia, like Indians, we were exploited, like Indians, we will free ourselves. Consequently, it became inevitable to consider that the self-determined indigenes are managing to perform their autochthony within and in between colonial modern situations in order to subvert the arbitrary subordinating ethnic identifications placed on them by others. The political agency of the self-called indigenes against and within the nation states are thus transliterating autochthony from an adjective to a noun, and as such they are managing to convert it into a collective right for plenty ethnic groups with their own histories of alterity formation. And that is where Brazilian public anthropology has gained most terrain and consequently its worst enemies. It is then precisely at this moment that public anthropology cannot give in to the weight of political pressures and go back to the recognition of the territorial rights of indigenous peoples semantically reduced to autochthony and cultural diversity as westernized biopolitical categories. The Brazilian case indicates that this would generate a legal setback of indigenous lands benefiting only those peoples classified as genuinely autochthonous, risking the revival of the ugly debate on authenticity. In fact, what a more contemporary conception of indigeneity teaches us all is that the rights of indigenous peoples to their lands should not be anchored, as it has been for biopolitical anthropology, solely on the idea of cultural diversity, but in moral and material reparation for the violence and dispossession they have suffered as a result of their subordination as culturally different. In these terms, public anthropology needs to better inform society about its objectives and ethical commitments to the promotion of social justice for indigenous peoples as a way to improve our societies and make it more respectful and responsible towards others. According to this perspective, the protection of either cultural or ecological diversity as a common good shall become a consequence of the achievement of widespread social justice. As it has been recently declared, a proper ecology is the result of an adequate anthropology. Indigenous peoples, categorized after this historical and sociological comprehension of indigeneity, are now numbering more than 476 million people in some 90 countries, representing a great part of the world's cultural diversity. Henceforth, anthropology, both in Brazil as elsewhere, is closely following the current developments of indigenous public ethnicity, learning how to refine the pernicious contents of autochthony along with indigenous perspectives and struggles that began with the hardships of being labeled autochthones in the first place. Therefore, autochthony remains a central issue for public anthropology, not because it properly depicts indigenous peoples, but because it doesn't. And that should guide us to intervene on public common sense. Collaboration with indigenous peoples as epistemic, political, and moral subjects is key for pushing forward such tasks. That is so because collaborative anthropologists develops a post-exotic anthropology, refusing the hierarchized patterns of research interaction structured by colonialism and neoliberal biopolitics. There are nowadays plenty collaborative ethnographies being worked out to illustrate the argument. What is important to keep in mind is the fact that collaborative anthropologies present itself under many different names. Public anthropology, like Rob Borowski, anthropology by demand, as mentioned by Rita Segato, action research and participatory construction of knowledge, as Joanne Rappaport poses, activist or engaged anthropology, Ida Susser, that I mentioned earlier, implicated anthropology, as mentioned by Bruce Albert, just to indicate a few. Apparently, all of them have in common the commitment to social justice as a political, legal, and moral path to build a common good culture, not exactly as an utopia, but as counter dystopias. All these contributions to reorient anthropology are important to place intercultural dialogue at the heart of collaborative involvement with indigenous co-workers and co-authors within everyday lives. By doing public anthropology with intercultural collaborative methodologies, the results will be ethically and epistemically more sound to present a land claim in terms of social justice and reparation instead of justifying it in terms of a stereotypical appreciation of cultural distinctiveness, which is vulnerable to public critiques to indigenous authenticity. I think this is a much more ethical and smart way to face up the accusations that are being played against anthropologists. After all, the discipline has a long tradition of employing empathy to guide observations and intuitions on different worlds, to construct social theory and amplify the human discourse on life in general. It surely creates sympathy in the process, and that sympathy has not compromised the ability of the discipline to think through rituals and representations and all the sentiments involved in it. On the contrary, it has worked out as the raw material of the discipline's findings and theory. Therefore, it would be simply wrong to refuse it and regress to a chimerical search for objectivity and neutrality in order to correspond to non-practitioners' commonsensical notions about how the anthropological métier should work. I hope to have defended in this conference that anthropology is best defined by the ways it ethically engages itself with social justice and social reality, considered as a cultural whole, not separate from itself. Defined as such, it has been assuming full responsibility for the interpretations and meanings and interventions brought to the public scrutiny. It is never too much to remember that most of the time, for the same reason, it is forced to deal with the distorted projections that its own cultures produces about others not identical to them. Anthropology thus has the task to act as the critical awareness against such unjust processes of othering, even if it is equally wronged for this. Thank you for listening and bearing with me until now. I'm ready for the discussion. Thank you.